Hey there, all you cool cats and kittens. It's your boy, Mr. Bennett, back at it again with another history lesson. This time covering Chapter 15, Crisis and Resurgence, Lesson 2, Lesson dos, Ford and Carter, but again, mostly Jimmy Carter. We're not going to talk a whole lot about what happens under Gerald Ford, so without any further ado, let's get crack-a-lackin'. So, President Gerald Ford serves in office from 1973 to 1977. So let's open up by talking a little bit about the situation that Ford finds himself in, right? What does he walk into as president now that Nixon has stepped down? So one of the issues that the American public has with Gerald Ford is that he's never been elected, right? So Richard Nixon's first vice president, Spiro Agnew, is out, right, because of the bribery and shenanigans that happened when he was governor. And so he's out. Nixon gets to pick a new vice president who wasn't on the ticket with him. And then Nixon resigns, leaving Ford president, even though he's never been elected. And so people have a president that they technically don't really want, that they didn't pick. And so he was also the vice president under Nixon, who is probably the most unpopular president in American history at that point. He's pretty thoroughly hated. So to cap this all off, the first thing Ford does is forgive Nixon. He pardons him of any crimes, and this is the kicker, all future crimes that may come out too. He says, look, anything Nixon did, it's fine. He's pardoned. He cannot be touched, right? This guy cannot be said to have done anything illegal. So Nixon gets away absolutely scot-free, which just makes Ford look like essentially an accomplice in all of this, and it really makes him look horrible. He's heavily criticized for this. Now let's talk about the economy, and that's really going to be a big focus during both the Ford and Carter presidencies. The American economy is just crumbling at this point due to a series of actions taken by the federal government, along with the ramifications of that really unpopular Vietnam War. So the main worry that we had in America at that point is this thing called stagflation. Essentially, that is when you have incredibly high unemployment, right? People aren't working and people are looking for it, but they can't find it. And you have inflation, right? Rising prices and wages are not keeping up with them. So things are really expensive and nobody has jobs. That is stagflation, and that is obviously bad. That is not something you want to have. And that stagflation is going to carry out through all of the 1970s. It's going to be a major theme. Then in 1973, to kind of, stick the knife in and twist it a little bit to make things worse, you have this organization known as OPEC. That's the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Companies, who are predominantly Middle Eastern Arabic countries, with the exception of a couple Central and South American countries that are in there as well. And most of these countries are mad about the United States government's and military's involvement in the Yom Kippur War that we talked briefly about in the last lesson. And so as a result of this, right, because we're intervening on the side of Israel to punish us, OPEC raises prices on oil. So it makes gasoline more expensive, which means it's going to be less available, leading to things like that picture in the top right-hand corner. That is a line for people trying to get gas. Gas was becoming more and more expensive, which means that people wanted to buy it while it was still cheap, so people were rushing to the pump, buying as much as they could, filling up their tanks, which means that by the end of the day, right, you get out of work, you might not be able to get any gasoline for your car. So it was a little ridiculous, and people were constantly running out of gas. People were carpooling. It had a major effect on not just our economy, but on our culture. Then in 1975, we see the Helsinki Accords that get worked out between the United States and the USSR, and it kind of reduces tension, carrying on these themes from Nixon of détente, right, of mitigating and minimizing these Cold War tensions between these two superpowers. So it does secure these borders that all of these new satellite countries had following World War II, secures the borders and says, hey, the rest of the world has to respect these, including the USSR. And Russia also promises to protect human rights. But again, as you're going to find out as we get further into this course, that is not always the case. If anything, it's rarely the case, right? Russia's got a pretty spotty track record when it comes to protecting human rights. So 1977, we see Carter step in as president because Americans do not like the Republican Party. That's how bad the Watergate scandal was with Nixon. The economy's in the tank. Nobody can get gasoline for their cars. Oil is super expensive. Nobody liked Ford to begin with. And so, given the opportunity, the American public elects Jimmy Carter over Gerald Ford, and he takes office in 1977. So Jimmy Carter promises in his inauguration speech, right, that he's going to clean up corruption. He wants to get rid of this whole negative view that the Americans have of their federal government. And it doesn't go as well as he would like. Part of that is because the economy is still terrible, right? Inflation, stagflation remains a problem. And at this point, inflation is over 10%, meaning that things have gotten 10% more expensive. Interest rates are up to 20%. That's absolutely astounding. Like, that's 6 to 8 times more than it is today. And unemployment continues to skyrocket, right? So America's economy is not doing very well. So Jimmy Carter attempts to do some things to solve some of these problems. One, he creates the Department of Energy, which is literally just going to manage our oil supply. It's going to manage how we essentially acquire and produce oil within our country and how we trade with other countries. On a side note, it also is created to regulate the production of nuclear energy. So our nuclear energy is actually under the Department of Energy. So they have access to all of the nuclear energy that's being produced, right? Nuclear factories. He starts cutting federal spending. That doesn't work because you can only cut so much, right? If you start cutting social programs, then people start getting sick and dying. And creates the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to develop standards for the use of nuclear energy, right? We're now seeing nuclear energy used not as a weapon, but as a tool to provide relatively clean energy compared to fossil fuels like coal and oil, natural gas. Now, this Nuclear Regulatory Commission is created as a result of a horrific event known as 3 Mile Island. 3 Mile Island in New York. There's a nuclear meltdown in 1979, and it is absolutely horrendous. Like, we've never seen really the effects of a nuclear, not an explosion, but a meltdown in the United States. And so that becomes heavily publicized. And I'm sorry, it's not New York, it is Pennsylvania. I don't know why I said New York. But 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. And it's the worst accident of its kind. To compare that to something more contemporary, right, there's the Fukushima disaster in Tokyo, right? It makes the area around it, essentially uninhabitable. Regarding education, he does pass a bill that requires bilingual instruction for students trying to learn English. So that is why all public schools have to offer some kind of bilingual accommodations for English language learners. We can thank President Jimmy Carter and the administration of the 1970s and early 80s for doing that. And then finally, one of the more positive things that he does is pass the Community Reinvestment Act in 1977. And it just says, right, the TLDR of it is that banks have to make credit available in poor communities, right? People can't get out of poverty by starting small businesses, by doing creative ventures in terms of starting any kind of business or buying a car, house, if they can't get loans. And the common practice back then was for banks to just literally take out a map and draw on a map with a red pen or a red pencil. They would draw a red line, right? This process is called redlining. And they'd say, we're not going to loan to anybody here, right? And they'd draw it out on a map. And those areas were typically poor areas, typically areas where you had lots of people of color. And so it was impossible for these at-risk individuals to get the assistance that they needed. And so Carter says, look, no, you can't deny people access to credit just because of where they live. He says that's absolutely ridiculous. And so he does make that change. All right, now let's talk about foreign policy, where he does, again, have some challenges. So Carter, as we mentioned with Gerald Ford and Nixon and LBJ before him, right, wants to focus on human rights, making sure that people have access to basic amenities, making sure that everyone's being treated fairly. So he first condemns the apartheid. We haven't really talked about that in this class, but it does come up hopefully in your previous classes, right? World history, which was the ongoing segregation and discrimination and racism in South Africa between white South Africans and black South Africans. And he also says he's going to stop sending federal aid to dictatorships. Now, he also pressures the USSR into stopping their anti-Semitic immigration policies. So in the USSR at that point, they were trying to limit the number of Jewish peoples that could come in, and they said, look, that's obviously wrong, right? You can't stop people from migrating. And then in 1977, he facilitates the signing of the Panama Canal Treaty, which gives the Panama Canal and the area around it, he gives the area around the canal back to the Panamanians and promises to return the canal itself in 1999. And so that has obviously come and gone, but we give the canal and the land around it to the Panamanians, which greatly helps out their economy because they're able to collect taxes on that land. And then in 1977, this is probably his greatest foreign policy achievement. He works out what are known as the Camp David Accords. So America, traditionally, we've been very supportive of Israel and Western democracy in the Middle East. We helped create the nation of Israel following World War II, and that caused lots of problems. And so Israel itself has been at odds with Egypt, along with a number of other countries, since its inception in 1948 following World War II. So these two warring countries, Israel and Egypt, he invites their leaders, first Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, and this guy Menachem Begin, the prime minister of Israel, to Camp David. Camp David, for those of you that don't know, is the presidential retreat, right? It's the official vacation area, private, secluded area for the president to go visit, and he can invite dignitaries. He says, hey, you guys are leaders of these countries that are having constant problems with each other. Let's come and let's work it out. And so ultimately, they work out an agreement that returns the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, which Israel had been claiming. So it's that triangular peninsula between Egypt and Israel. They give it back to Egypt, and they work out diplomatic relations. They say, hey, we're going to start talking. Previously, they hadn't talked, right? They were not communicating. They were not trying to work this out. They just wanted to fight. And this ends nearly 30 years of war. This is a huge achievement in the Middle East to get these two countries that are politically opposed, that are religiously opposed, right? Because you have Muslims in Egypt and Jewish people in Israel. He gets them to stop fighting after 30 years. Spoiler alert, it's only temporary. So the negotiations fall apart afterwards. But before they do, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin both win the Nobel Peace Prize, right, for ending all of this conflict. The Palestinians that are living in Israel, right, they had their land taken from them when Israel was created. They're mad that they didn't get a piece of the action in this, that they were not invited to the table, and that they don't get a homeland out of this, right? So they are a people, they're an ethnicity, they're a nationality without a homeland living in Israel, essentially in diaspora. And so all of the neighbors around Egypt in the Middle East, all of these Arab countries, they're super chapped, very upset with Egypt. And ultimately, this leads to Anwar Sadat being assassinated upon his return to the Middle East by Muslim fundamentalists because he decided to be friendly to the Jewish people and to support essentially, Western democracy and with that Christianity and Judaism. And so there were a lot of layers to this political onion, and it led to one of these leaders being assassinated. Now, bouncing across the way over to the USSR, in 1970, Russia and the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. So this plants the seed for what will essentially cause and lead to September 11th, 2001. I just want you to be aware of that this is where all of that kind of stems from. So in 1979, Russia invades Afghanistan. There's resources in Afghanistan that they want access to, right? They want to spread communism there. And so we, in response, stop selling grain to Russia. We boycott the Olympics in 1980 that are happening in Moscow, in Russia. And all of these talks that had started under Nixon, those strategic arms limitation talks, we stopped having those, right? We had originally agreed to stop making defensive missiles and nuclear missiles, and we kind of back off on those agreements. So we irk Russia, and we also, I don't have it up there on the slides, but we also start sending support to the Afghanis to help them fight the Russians, right? And this is when we start giving literal weapons and money to the groups of people that will become Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan. So we plant that seed here in the late 1970s and early 1980s. But long story short, all the good work that had been done by Nixon in terms of Russia, out the door. Like it is gone now. All right, and then finally, the last chapter, the last little bit regarding Jimmy Carter, the Iranian Revolution and subsequent Iranian hostage crisis. So the United States at that point, we are allies with Iran. Iran's very or relatively progressive for a Middle Eastern country at that point. They were, what we would consider Western clothing. They have Western ideals. They're not really fundamental when it comes to religion. And so we are allied with them and their leader, this guy, the Shah Pahlavi. The Shah is the title, his last name's Pahlavi. So Pahlavi is a brutal dictator, but we're cool with it because we helped him become the dictator, right? We installed this guy previously. We helped him become the leader of Iran. Now, the Shah Pahlavi had promised things were going to get better in Iran. He was going to stop violating so many human rights, but he doesn't actually do that. Again, he's a dictator, but he's our dictator, so we're okay with it. And then in 1978, you have these protests and demonstrations break out against him, led by religious fundamentalists, Muslim religious fundamentalists. In 1979, the Shah Pahlavi leaves the country. He gets out of Dodge. He says, okay, I'm out, deuces, drops the mic. Then you have this religious leader, Khomeini, the Ayatollah Khomeini, Ayatollah again being a title, the Ayatollah Khomeini, and they seize control and they make Iran into a religious fundamentalist state, a Muslim state. So these are fundamentalist Shiite Muslims. They are anti-Western, meaning they're anti-American, anti-Israel, anti-Jew, really setting the stage for a lot of the problems in the Middle East that we're still seeing today. And so the Shah Pahlavi comes to the United States under the guise that he needs medical treatment. And there's some conflict because people believe that we're housing him here essentially as a political refugee, meaning that we are taking the side of him, this brutal dictator, and not the side of the people who overthrew this dictatorship, because at that point, the Ayatollah Khomeini isn't necessarily a dictator, right? This is who the people want. And so in response to us accepting Pahlavi into our country, you have a bunch of Iranian students who are mad, right? And they march on with guns and seize the U.S. embassy in Tehran, Iran, and they keep hostages there for over a year. So something like 111 hostages, and they keep them locked up there, and sometimes they parade people out, and they're beating and torturing them. It's bad. So we tried on several occasions to free the hostages. We bungled it a lot of times. It was not good. And so we were unable to do that under Carter's presidency. And then finally, literally the day that Carter leaves office and the next president, Ronald Reagan, takes office, negotiations are completed and they get released. So Carter, again, puts in all the footwork for freeing these hostages, but Reagan gets all the credit. And so as a result, particularly between this hostage crisis and the ongoing economic problems and the things happening throughout the Middle East and with Russia, Carter goes down in flames, and he is absolutely blown out by the next president of the United States, Ronald Reagan. So let's look at a couple of questions. So we've got our first star practice question here. So these demonstrations led to, so let's see, this is a memorandum from the White House, a memorandum for the president from David Aaron regarding the Iranian demonstrations on October 31st, 1979. So Thursday is a religious holiday in Tehran, and the authorities have called for a massive religious political demonstration to protest U.S. policy in the presence of the Shah in the United States. Police in Tehran anticipate up to 1 million demonstrators. 1 million, that's a lot. The program calls for public prayers and a rally in the working class district in South Tehran, followed by a march into town. So these demonstrations led to what? Was it A, a global energy crisis brought on by an OPEC oil embargo? B, the bombing of a Marine barrack, followed by retaliatory U.S. airstrikes? C, a U.S. boycott of the Olympics in protest of events in Central Asia? Or D, a hostage crisis that severely damaged confidence in the Carter administration? Take a moment, look through the answers, right? These things, demonstrations happening in Iran, lead to what? That's right. The answer is D, right? The Iranian hostage crisis. Going on to question 2. The events described in this excerpt provide evidence of which political situation? So this is from the RSC policy brief regarding government shutdowns, Republican Study Committee in 2011. So this is a bit more contemporary, but since 1977, the government is shut down on 17 occasions. So a government shutdown is when the government cannot reach an agreement on the budget, And so because the budget does not get passed, absolutely nothing is going on because nothing can get paid for. So there were 6 shutdowns during the Carter administration, all of them lasting for more than a week, and one for 17 days. 6 shutdowns during Carter's presidency. There were 8 shutdowns during the Reagan administration, none longer than 3 days, and 1 3-day shutdown during the first Bush administration. The 2 most recent government shutdowns occurred in 1995 and 1996. The first lasted for 5 days in November, and the second for 21 days in December and January. So that was as of 2011. We have since had several government shutdowns. But they're saying these government shutdowns provide evidence of what ongoing political situation? Is it F, growing solidarity between the executive and judicial branches? G, an increase in the number of legislators who vote against party lines? H, a lack of cooperation between the legislative and executive branches? And J, the refusal by the Supreme Court to intervene in legislative matters. So again, you have to think a little deeper for this one, right? It mentions Carter, but it's about a bigger theme that you can kind of guess from the background of the things we've talked about. What do you think would contribute to the government shutting down, right? When we talk about government shutdowns, it means that they cannot get a budget passed, right? Hopefully you can tell that the president has some pull in that. He can introduce a budget and make suggestions. Take a minute, think about that information and see what answer it leads you to. Hopefully it leads you to letter H, right? A lack of cooperation between the legislative and executive branches. Because the legislature and the president can't agree, this leads to government shutdowns. Question 3. How did President Jimmy Carter attempt to end hostilities between the groups that fought these wars? So we have selected wars between Israeli and Arab forces. So you have the first Arab-Israeli War, 1948 to 49, the Six-Day War, June 67, the Yom Kippur War, October 73. So how does Carter attempt to end these hostilities? Does he F, help negotiate a peace treaty known as the Camp David Accords? G, deploy U.S. troops to defeat the Palestine Liberation Organization, otherwise known as the PLO? H, he ordered the boycott of the Olympic Games in Moscow? Or J, he threatened to sever diplomatic ties with Syria? What did Jimmy Carter do that essentially tried to make things better in the Middle East? Take a moment, look at the answers. Hopefully you come to the correct answer, which is, that's right, F, the Camp David Accords. Question 4. In 1979, the Shah of Iran was forced into exile. The U.S. government later allowed the Shah to enter the United States for medical treatment. This perceived U.S. support for the Shah of Iran resulted in which of the following? Was it F, Iran attacked a U.S. military base in Asia? G, Soviet forces began an occupation of Iran? H, Israel demanded U.S. support for the strategic bombing of cities in Iran? Or J, revolutionaries kidnapped a group of U.S. citizens in Iran? What happened in Iran because we helped the Shah Pahlavi? Take a moment. Good moment. Hopefully you came to the correct answer, and that answer is J, right? The Iranian hostage crisis. So that's it for today, and next time we'll be picking up with Ronald Reagan, talking about his new conservatism and domestic policies in the 1980s. Pictured there on the top right, we've got Ronald Reagan and his right-hand man, his vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, right? George Bush 1. And that's where we'll pick up tomorrow. So looking forward to you guys checking out these videos. If you've got any questions, drop them down in the comments, and I'll catch you on the flip side. Thank you so much for tuning in.